Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Pillow, Hover, and Linode. I'm John Voorhees, and with me, of course, is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I am hanging in there. I'm doing all right. You know, it's been a good week. Lots of apps are coming out. I'm just so excited about Big Sur now that I'm both done with my review and getting to see everything that developers are doing because I had some examples of widgets and third-party apps in the review, but there's been so much that has kind of flooded onto the Mac App Store in the last 10 days or so. I'm still sorting through it, and we'll have a lot more stuff on Mac Stories in due time. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It's an exciting time to be a fan of apps on all platforms, really.
Well, you need to give me some of those apps. You need to write about them. Otherwise, I don't know what to install from the App Store. I feel lost without your coverage.
I know. Well, it'll be coming, Federico. I've been catching up on a lot of other things that I neglected for a while there, but it's on its way. So
I know.
Stay tuned.
It's nice to do that every once in a while, right? To kind of finally have the time to, get rid of like something that I always enjoy doing. For example, switch from the test flight version of an app to the App Store release. Like all those things that accumulate on your device, all that craft. Unread emails and RSS and new apps that you've been meaning to check out, all those things. It's nice to, after a long period of work, to go in there and clean up. And I don't know, I feel so much better when I do that on my phone, on my iPad. It's like rearranging your bedroom and, tidying up and making sure that everything is in place. It's a good feeling.
Yes, it is a good feeling. Everything that I had was a complete mess by the end of the review season. So I'm slowly getting there. I'm there on my phone, I think, until Apple decided to change things in beta 2 of 14.3 with those compact UI for home screen shortcuts. But yeah, that may change things around. But things are much more tidy and neat as they stand already. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Pillow. Getting a good night's sleep is underrated, but with a little help, it can be life-changing. Pillow is an all-in-one sleep tracking solution to help you be more aware of your sleep patterns and discover what might be affecting them. It's easy to fall into bad sleep habits, but with Pillow, you can get back on track. If you have an Apple Watch, tracking your sleep is as easy as wearing your Apple Watch to bed. Pillow will track and analyze your sleep automatically. One of Pillow's most beloved features is its ability to track your heart rate during every sleep session. You can even compare your sleep quality with your weight, steps, caffeine consumption, and many more health metrics to discover what might be affecting your sleep. Pillow can optionally record sounds that you make during sleep, from sleep talking to sleep apnea and snoring or unexpected noises that might be affecting your sleep. A lot of users have been surprised by the results. Pillow is also very privacy-minded. All your sleep and audio data is encrypted and stored on your device and in your iCloud storage account using end-to-end encryption. Pillow doesn't have user accounts, so you can use it anonymously, and it doesn't collect or send your personal data anywhere else. Naps are a great way to boost your creativity and overall well-being. If you're working from home, give it a try. The Power Nap feature of Pillow is pretty cool. If you need an alarm, Pillow can wake you up using your iPhone, Apple Watch, or your iPad. And if you have watchOS 6 or later installed on your Apple Watch, the latest update of Pillow uses the new extended runtime to minimize battery consumption on the Apple Watch. Pillow has a new home screen widget to help you track your latest sleep analysis and daily sleep goals, too. Pillow is available on the App Store for the iPhone, Apple Watch, and iPad. Discover all of Pillow's features at pillow.app. Again, that URL is pillow.app. I'll put a link in the show notes, too. Pillow, sleeping better, made simple. All right, Federico, for today, I thought, obviously we got big news this week. We got news about the App Store Small Business Program.
Yep.
And we wrote about that on Mac Stories, but I thought maybe that's something we could explore a little more deeply and go a little bit beyond just this one program, because I think it's the latest news, obviously, but there's a lot more going on here, and it's really been a big year of change for the App Store and a lot of improvements. I mean, there's obviously things that could be done that we'll talk about to make things even better than they are. But there has been a lot of change and a lot of movement by Apple on a number of fronts, and we thought we'd talk about that.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Obviously it has been a challenging year for everybody, and Apple mentioned this in their announcement of the App Store Small Business Program.
Right.
But this isn't the only initiative that Apple is taking this year to improve the App Store as an ecosystem, as a marketplace. We're going to talk about some of those other changes. But before we do that, John, why don't you put your lawyer hat on and explain to me, although in simpler terms, can you give me the breakdown of the details of the App Store Small Business Program, how it works, and sort of how the numbers work?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's not as simple as it might be, and I'm sure that there's a reason for that. We can kind of speculate about that in a minute. But the way it works is that if you're an app developer and make less than $1 million after accounting for Apple's commission,
Right.
then you are eligible to only have to pay 15%. So if you end 2020 with less than $1 million after you take out the 30% that you pay Apple as a developer, then in 2021, you'll pay 15%. Now, if during 2021 you break $1 million, then you're going to have to pay 30% on the rest of your revenue that year. And then the following year, you'll be at 30% again. So the way it works is you have to have the income for a particular year has to be less than $1 million after Apple's commission before you're eligible, and you're not eligible again until the following year. So there's a possibility that if you break $1 million, that kind of puts you on pause until the year after the next one, if you follow me.
Right.
Now, new developers are also eligible for this. So if you're brand new to the App Store, you've never published an app, you're eligible for the program as well. And it includes all of the income really that you get from apps. This is not just like a paid upfront thing. It also applies to in-app purchases and subscriptions and that sort of thing. That's about all we know at this point. Apple has said there are going to be more details coming in December, and I think it'll be interesting to see what the details are, because this is designed as a program, not as an automatic thing. If we're automatic, you would think they would do a program that was something like, all right, the first $1 million is just 15% for everybody, or maybe for people who have less than a certain amount of income. But it's not like that. It's like if you have more than $1 million of income after Apple's fees, then you qualify to be in the program. And so there's going to be some determination made at some point in this process by Apple as to whether you qualify as a developer for this. And it's not an automatic calculation at all. And I think that that's in part a control thing from Apple's standpoint, because I'm sure that they want to make sure that the system's not game, that there aren't loopholes that can somehow slip into here. I mean, it does have some potential downsides, because you can imagine a situation where a developer is approaching a certain amount of revenue in a given year, and then takes their apps off the App Store because if they make more than that, then the following year they'll be at 30% all year. And if you you have to make assumptions though, right? It's like, all right, if you assume that your revenue is roughly the same the next year, you'd want to take your apps off the App Store to preserve the 15% going forward. But I don't know. I mean, it'll be interesting to see if there are details in the actual program that address things like that. But there are potential strange incentives that could be created by the way the system is designed.
Do you think there could have been a better way to handle this, especially to avoid that problem of, developers approaching the $1 million threshold and then starting to game the system? Can you think of any precedents on any other alternatives that maybe could have worked?
Well, I mean, the simplest thing really is to just say that this program applies to, it's 15% for the first $1 million that you make. The difficulty with that is that obviously Apple wants to define this as something for small businesses. And as soon as you get into the endeavor of just defining what a small business is, there's always going to be some wiggle room or some loopholes or some sort of strange incentive created. It's something that I mean, lawyers face all the time when they're defining things. It's like, how do you define this in a way that you're not leaving some sort of loophole that makes it work in a way that you didn't intend, or that gives people incentives that you don't want to give them. And I think by defining this as income minus the fees in a calendar year, it's going to create some of those issues. And maybe there are some, footnotes to that can be used to try to mitigate some of those issues. But I don't think, short of applying it across the board to everyone on the App Store, I don't think there's I think just about any approach is going to have some sort of issues like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how in a way Apple is sort of following up on what they did a couple of years ago with recurring subscriptions when they dropped the commissions for the second year, right? If you're able to keep a customer around for an entire year at a 30% fee, you can then, that customer then switches automatically to a 15% fee. So Apple is not taking 30% out of that customer recurring subscription forever. Apple is now taking 15% for the second year and following years. And obviously, it is quite well known that for the past few years, Apple has been making a lot of exceptions with big companies, big players in the App Store,
sure,
that were not necessarily on the same 30% commission rate as other developers. Obviously, if you're Netflix or Disney or, these big companies, you probably have cut some kind of deal with Apple at some point, right? But I think what Apple is doing here is different and perhaps even more fascinating. They're saying the vast majority of apps on the App Store, the apps that we curate on a weekly basis, the apps that win Apple Design Awards, the apps that people discover, those are not making $1 million a year. And especially if you don't consider folks like EA and King, makers of those freemium games that I have to believe vastly exceed $1 billion per year. They probably generate $1 billion per week. So counting out those games, Apple is saying we care about all these apps and we want to make it easier for developers to make a living on the App Store. Now, my question to you is, why now? Which I think is it just because of the pandemic and everything going on, or do you think there's something else? And by something else, I mean, do you think this is Apple's not so subtle response to all the scrutiny by different governments around the world in terms of antitrust and anti-competitive law? Do you think this is Apple trying to say, hey, look, we also want to do better on the App Store, so we're going to take less money from developers?
So before I get to that, I would say that the subscription deal that you just covered about the 85-15 split on subscriptions, that is a good example of a way to do this that would be simpler and cleaner, because that does apply to everybody. And that's exactly what I was talking about. They don't have the same kind of strange incentives built into the structure or loopholes that might exist. But getting to what you just asked about what's going on here and why now, I think it is absolutely driven by scrutiny on Apple. And then we have these other things that we're going to talk about as well. There's a lot that's happened this year. And a lot of it, I think you can point to specific things that have been raised in Congress in the US or with the EU. And one of the things I think is important here is that you can kind of hold two thoughts in your mind at one time here. I do think that government regulation has a role to play here, and I think it's a significant role. However, there are different ways to address government regulation and pressure to get out of the bind that Apple has found itself in with the US government and the EU. And not all of them are necessarily beneficial to developers. They could, for instance, just hire tons of lobbyists to try to lobby their way out of the issue. And I think that when people look at this, the cynical take is, well, Apple's doing this only because it's getting pressure from governments. And I think that that's absolutely a piece of it. But I think it can also simultaneously be true that the solution that they've come up with is one that's designed to help developers and that they want to help developers as well. I think that those two things are not necessarily inconsistent. You can debate the degree to which each one of these was in a part of the decision-making process. But at the end of the day, Apple does rely on its developers to help promote its products. And so I do think developers are important to Apple. And I do think that they're important to a lot of the people who work at Apple. Whether the final decision here was made by lawyers and the top executives at Apple based on antitrust law and that sort of thing, I don't know. I'm sure played a large factor. But I also feel as though these sorts of things that we've seen happen this year are also tailored to try to address the issues in a meaningful way that actually addresses the problem as opposed to just get the government off their backs, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think the point about Apple caring about developers is also important because these are the developers who often come up with features, with ideas, with apps that sort of define a new trajectory for different categories of apps, different features on iPhone and iPad, which Apple eventually copies. When we say Apple is Sherlocking this app or that other app, that's usually because an independent developer came up with an idea that became popular,
Right.
and eventually those ideas, they inspire, we should say, Apple to actually make it into a system feature that ends up being something that millions of people use every day. So a healthy indie development ecosystem, I think it's essential to any modern digital marketplace. That is one of my core beliefs. Whether it's about video games or apps, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, I think one thing that I think is worth addressing too is that I have seen some comments here and there that this COVID thing is just window dressing because after all, people are stuck at home. And so they're using their devices a lot more. So developers are all doing really well. And you and I both know very well that that's not true, right?
No.
Not true at all. I mean, yes, there are some apps that have done particularly well because people are stuck at home. But it's not something that has had an effect across the board. It's had a different impact on different developers in a number of different ways. And we know a lot of people who have seen their revenue hit very significantly, 30, 40 plus percent downturn during the course of 2020. So this is a meaningful change that is going to help a lot of these smaller developers stay in business.
Yeah, absolutely.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Hover. When you have that one big idea, where do you go? Well, your business starts with a domain name. So for many entrepreneurs, Hover is the first stop. Hover has over 300 domain name extensions to choose from. No matter what you want to build, there's a domain name waiting for it. And they have excellent technical support to answer any questions that you might have. And they're dedicated to getting you online, not upselling you. Hover has free Whois privacy so the bad guys don't get your information, a clean UX and UI, monthly sales on popular top-level domains. It's easy to see why Hover is the popular choice for people starting a business. Hover was one of the first places that I went when I started a business because I wanted to see if the domain name was available, and that's exactly what I did. I went on Hover, made sure the name I wanted was available, got the .com, and I've had it for years ever since. I've got something like 7 different domains registered with Hover, and I've been super happy with their service. I know you like intuitive user experiences and things that just work straight out of the box, so I know you'll appreciate Hover as much as I do. Their UX and UI really is simple, clean, and easy to navigate. Buy your domain and start using it today. Go to hover.com/appstories so they know you came from the show and to get a 10% discount on all new purchases. Again, that URL is hover.com/appstories. Make a name for yourself with Hover. Our thanks to Hover for their support of the show.
I want to talk about the things that Apple has done in 2020 to try and address some of the criticisms surrounding the App Store, because obviously this is the big one, right? Dropping the commission fee from 30 to 15 is something that a lot of people arguably never thought that Apple would really do, and they've done that. So obviously this is the most important one. But Apple has also done some other things, and they're doing some other things because they're not done yet. So obviously in 2020, in iOS 14, we finally got the ability to change the default email and browser app on our devices, on iPhone and iPad. Whether you want to use Google Chrome or Firefox, or you want to use Gmail, Outlook, some other email clients, you can do that. And unfortunately, the feature was not that stable at launch. You wrote about it on Mac Stories. It seems to have gotten better through subsequent releases to iOS 14. So this is also a big one. We never thought that Apple would actually do this, but yeah, you can set Google Chrome on your iPhone as your default browser, and all links will open in Google Chrome. So that's very nice.
Yeah, there was a point at which just restarting your phone would set it back to the default app. And I think that reappeared at some point. Maybe it was 14.1, but I believe that it's been fixed again. Yes.
Yeah, it needed to be fixed a bunch of times. You can also now change you wrote about this, John. You can change your default music service on your HomePod. You wrote about Pandora, which I think it's the only music service at this point. But I mean, you got to believe that Spotify is coming eventually, right?
Yeah. Pandora is the only one at the moment. And I think it was the iPhone event where Apple said that Amazon Music was coming too. And that has not appeared yet. But, Apple's put those pieces in place to allow third-party streaming services to use them. It's just that not all of them have implemented it yet. And so far, Pandora is the only one. But you got to think that even though Spotify and Apple have been fighting with each other a fair amount, and Spotify is one of the companies that ran to the EU about Apple's business practices, that notwithstanding those conflicts, just like Apple has had a long history of legal conflicts with Samsung, the two companies still work together. And I do expect that we'll see Spotify at some point, because it's in Spotify's interest, after all, to make Spotify something that you can use on as many devices as possible.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Also, following the very public dispute with the Hey email service earlier in the summer, Apple made another change to the App Store. Actually, this is a twofold change. Developers can now challenge App Store guidelines. There's a formal process for saying, hey, I disagree with this guideline. I think this is outdated, or this is unfair, or this is wrong. And there is a new system for you to challenge an App Store review guideline as it applies to one of your apps on the App Store. Additionally, should one of these disputes with app review surface for an app that has an update being held in review, Apple will no longer block bug fix updates in the app review queue. So if you're a developer and if you have a major new feature and you're having a disagreement with app review and your app is stuck in review, you can continue arguing your case regarding that specific feature or that specific design change. But in the meantime, you can still submit bug fix updates to make sure that the app continues working in its current state for existing users, which I think is a good approach, right? So often developers are working on a new feature and Apple doesn't want to approve that new feature, but at the same time, maybe that update that they're working on also contains bug fixes for users. And so I think it's good that at the same time, while you're challenging an App Store review guideline, you can still submit bug fixes and Apple will approve those.
Right, because we've seen situations in the past that we know of where that has absolutely been the fact, where a new feature has held up the entire process, and there are other fixes that needed to be made that couldn't be made because of the review process. And this is very directly related to Hey, because the way Hey played out was that the app was approved, and then the company went back with bug fixes right after the launch, and the bug fixes got held up while the dispute was going on.
Right.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Linode. Whether you're working on a personal project or managing your enterprise's infrastructure, you deserve simple, affordable, and accessible cloud computing solutions that allow you to take your project to the next level. That's something we are doing at Mac Stories. We have a bunch of projects in process right now, and we've been deploying them on Linode, and it's been fantastic. It works super well. You can simplify your cloud infrastructure with Linode's Linux virtual machines, helping you develop, deploy, and scale your modern applications faster and easier. Quite frankly, anything that you could do to make your workflow faster and easier is worth checking out. Linode has 11 global data centers and provides 24/7 human support 365 days a year. So you never get stuck without support. Night or day, holiday or not, Linode are there with no tiers or handoffs regardless of your plan size. And you can check it all out for free. Get started right now on Linode today with $100 and free credit for listeners of App Stories by going to linode.com/appstories. In addition to shared and dedicated compute instances, you can use your $100 credit on S3 compatible object storage, managed Kubernetes, and a whole lot more. So go on over to linode.com/appstories and click on the Create Free Account button to get started. Go there now and check it out. Our thanks to Linode for their support of the show.
And lastly, I want to mention how supposedly there's a big change coming in iOS 14.3, which is currently in public and developer beta. Supposedly, it is launching at some point before the end of the year because the rumor goes this will be the update that will introduce Apple Fitness Plus. In any case, 9to5Mac found some code strings in the 14.3 beta, hinting at the ability for iOS 14.3 to suggest third-party apps during setup. So while you're setting up an iPhone or iPad, it looks like you will get third-party app suggestions as you're setting up your new device. This is going to be a big deal. Imagine being one of those apps, right? Millions of people setting up their devices, are upgrading from an old phone to a new iPhone and finding, say, Bear or Craft or, I don't know, Reader, all Todoist, all kinds of third-party apps as recommendations during setup. That will be pretty incredible for third-party developers. I'm really curious to see how Apple does it. There are some precedents for this. Apple is not new to recommending third-party apps. Of course, they have, hundreds, if not thousands of sections on the App Store where they curate apps. But outside of the App Store, I think one of the most interesting places to look for third-party app recommendations is, stay with me, the Health app on your phone.
True.
The Health app has recommendations for individual categories of health data. So Apple recommends sleep tracking apps and pedometer apps, nutrition apps, but also in iOS 14, Apple also recommends third-party apps in the wind down section. When you're setting up shortcuts for winding down before going to sleep, Apple actually recommends third-party apps from different categories, such as podcast clients, task managers, note-taking apps, journal, and diary logging apps. It's really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And also obviously in the shortcuts gallery, which Apple maintains and curates, they do have sections for shortcuts belonging to third-party apps. So shortcuts for Todoist, shortcuts for OmniFocus, for Evernote, all kinds of apps that integrate with shortcuts. But I mean, that's one thing. Having a section of third-party app recommendations at setup is a much bigger deal.
It is a bigger deal. And don't forget the Watch app too, because the Watch app has a whole tab for apps, which, I mean, I actually forget that's there all the time and don't go browsing for Watch apps personally, but it is there. And I agree though, at setup, your entire focus when you're setting up your phone is getting your phone set up. I mean, you don't go into a setup with the, and then walk away for 2 hours. You're setting up your phone and you're kind of focused on it, waiting for the next step. And if while you're waiting for the next step, you're seeing a curated list of apps that Apple suggests, I think that's going to really drive sales for a lot of those apps. All right, Federico, I think, as we've seen through the course of this conversation, there have been a lot of changes made this year, but there's always more, and we can always hope for more, and we can always wish for more. And hopefully Apple will continue to evolve the App Store and its relationship with developers, because Things are very different in 2020 than they were in 2008. I mean, that's in part why we saw this change with the fee structure. That maybe made sense in 2008, but developers know it didn't make sense. And it hasn't made sense for a very long time now. And it's good to see it change. But there are things that can still be done. And, one of the things that I know you and I have probably talked about in the past on the show is we'd love to see the default music service be an option that you can change as well. I mean, we've already got email and browser. Okay. Those are good. I mean, those are two things that people use an awful lot on their phones and their iPads, but music is another. And there are a lot of different music services out there. And, music would be a good one to be able to change on your phone as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I definitely want to see more freedom in terms of the defaults that you can change. And I know that some of them are going to be extremely challenging and difficult, right?
Sure.
It's one thing to change a browser that all it needs to do is open effectively a URL scheme. But things like, even maps for navigation or music, all these services that have really deep ties with Siri, for example.
And CarPlay and
CarPlay and the watch. Like, I can imagine it being quite challenging for Apple to figure out. But I mean, it's also Apple. It's a big company. They have the resources to figure this out. And I think, maybe starting small with music and the task manager, for example, when you say, remind me too, why should reminders be the default if you use Todoist or OmniFocus or some other task manager? So starting small but expanding the defaults, I think, would be a good idea. Something that I really would like to see, John, is, and this is quite complex, side loading on iOS and iPadOS. So I have been using AltStore on my iPad. So AltStore, for those not aware, is an alternative app store maintained by Riley Tested. And it's quite genius in that it doesn't require you to jailbreak your phone or your iPad. AltStore gets installed on your device using, I don't know the technical details, but basically you need to provide an Apple ID and you need to effectively sign with this Apple ID a beta on your device. That also involves installing on your Mac something called the Alt Server, which I think is the utility that actually does the signing for these apps that you're going to install, and also a plugin for Apple Mail. Right. And so months ago, I created an Apple ID just for AltStore, so something separate from my main developer Apple ID, just to make sure I want to use this thing, which is, I don't want to say shady, but, I don't think that Apple likes it. So if I'm going to sign in with an Apple ID, I'm going to set up one from scratch just for this. So that's what I did. And I've been using AltStore. I'm actually an AltStore Premium Pro subscriber. I subscribe to the Patreon for
right, and that way you get the beta version.
I get the beta version, and the beta version has new features before they hit the public release.
Right.
And I have been using emulators for old Nintendo consoles, and specifically I've been using Dolphin iOS, actually. Dolphin is a popular PC emulator for the GameCube and Nintendo Wii, and Dolphin iOS is a fork of the Dolphin emulator that lets you play GameCube and Wii games on your iPhone and iPad via AltStore. And I actually wrote about this on Mac Stories. Thanks to iOS 14.2, those emulators are even better because they can take advantage of something called JIT, which is just-in-time compilation, which means faster performance, better graphics, native access to a bunch
higher
of features.
Frame rates and that
higher
kind of
frame
thing,
rates.
Right?
And so via Dolphin, I've been playing old GameCube and Wii games, like stuff like Metroid Prime that came out 17 years ago, upscaled to 4K at 60 frames per second. It's just incredible.
Wow.
But the thing is, in AltStore, you can find a bunch of other stuff. For example, one of the apps that Riley created is called, I believe it's called Clip or Clip Plus, and it's a clipboard manager, right? That does something that we're so used to see on the Mac. Whenever you copy something on your system, it gets appended to the list of clipped items in your clipboard manager. And that's impossible to do on iOS due to sandboxing. But with AltStore, and with apps that are released via AltStore, which can use private entitlements, and private APIs that developers cannot use on the Apple App Store, that's possible. And so I've been doing this, and it showed me just how much better especially the iPad would be as a professional computer if only we had the freedom to install apps from other sources. And I don't think I am saying anything so absurd or so crazy, because it is possible on the Mac, and Apple has an entire system figured out on the Mac to do this securely in a way that Apple can immediately revoke the certificate of a developer via notarization and gatekeeper and all these other tools,
Right.
should something go bad with like malware and those kinds of things. And it has been possible on the Mac for several years now. And sure, a lot of people say, oh, but the iPhone and iPad, they hold a lot of important data and they're so much more important than a Mac. And that is true. But also, I do think that Apple keep important data on their Macs as well.
Yeah.
Like personal stuff and work documents.
Right. I mean, I don't buy the phone is more
Right.
needs to be more secure, because maybe you have your tax records on your Mac, but you don't have them on your iPhone. There's plenty of things that you put on your Mac that are both personal and that you want to keep secure. But yeah, I think that this would be fantastic. I have also used AltStore. I was using it with my iPad mini for a while because I was using a Game Vice controller, which is one of the game controllers that fit to the ends of an iPad mini, and it was really fun to play those Nintendo games on a bigger screen like that. But that version of AltStore, I think in 13 was limited to, maybe it was 13.5 or 13.6. I don't remember which version. It didn't go beyond a certain thing. So, but it's working with 14 now, it sounds like, as well.
Yeah, it's working on 14, and I don't know, the whole thing is just kind of incredible. And I think the idea of having Gatekeeper, right? Because that's what we're asking. Gatekeeper on iOS and iPadOS. I don't think, should that ever become possible, right? I don't think we will be in a situation where Apple is suddenly not making money from the App Store anymore. Because let's face it, most people will still like to go to the App Store and download the latest game or download, the latest popular app like Widgetsmith, and they're gonna buy in-app purchases, and Apple is still gonna make money.
Yes.
But this means that developers, like imagine folks like Panic, for example, they will be able to release something like Nova or Transmit on an iPad because they shouldn't be forced to follow the App Store guidelines and APIs and entitlements anymore. So again, my simple idea here, I think it's pretty simple. If it's possible on the Mac, why shouldn't it be possible on iPad? And especially on the iPad Pro, and especially at this point where the iPad Pro is so powerful and has a lot of the same features as a MacBook, arguably. I just don't get it. And I have to believe that more than a technical limitation, it's a political decision at this point.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, it does feel like the time is right because the push has been made, especially with the iPad, to define it as a professional device, and being able to sideload is a big part of that. And I'd really like to see this happen as well. It just feels like the time is absolutely right to make it happen. So I don't know. We'll see. Maybe there is a technical issue, but I would think that if there's a technical issue, it's a technical issue that Apple should try to find a way around if they can. Okay, Federico. Well, good discussion. I hope that Apple continues, whether it's due to government pressure or pressure from developers, to continue to evolve the App Store and its relationship with developers, because I think there's been some good progress this year, and there's still, as we've discussed, clearly still progress to be made. I want to thank our three sponsors again for this episode, and that is Pillow, Hover, and Linode. You can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico is on Twitter and Instagram, where he's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHEES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.